Well, good morning if you're on the West Coast, and good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. Hello, and welcome to the Health Literacy Solutions Center September webinar. My name is Escarlett Juarez, and I'll be moderating today. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I want to cover just a few housekeeping items. First, connect to audio using your computer speakers. All attendee microphones will be muted for the duration of the webinar, but please feel free to ask questions through the Q&A. After the presentation, the remaining 10 minutes will be dedicated to the Q&A. If you're not familiar with Q&A, it is found at the bottom of your screen. To bring it up, simply hover near the bottom of your screen and you'll see the Q&A symbol. If you click it, it will bring it up and you can send questions. If you're having some technical issues, send an email directly to support@healthliteracysolutions.org. And our technical support team will try to work it out for you. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and will be posted in the Health Literacy Solutions Center website in our archives. So you'll be able to access the webinar and all of our previous webinars on that Health Literacy Solutions Center site. After the webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to an evaluation form. Please take a moment to provide your feedback. We value it very much. For those of you who would like to receive CEU credits, you must submit a completed evaluation in order to receive your credits. So make sure that you keep an eye out for that email. With that, let's go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Joan Winchester, who is a writer and researcher at the Center for Health Literacy. She specializes in writing in plain language for print and web content and developing and conducting consumer testing. She also provides group training and presentations on plain language, health and health insurance literacy, and consumer testing. Before joining the center, Ms. Winchester was a reading specialist in Alexandria, Virginia, where she received the Alexandria Chamber of Commerce Excellence in Education Award. Joan, I will now turn over the presentation to you.
Thank you, and thank you all for joining us today. Today we're going to talk about communicating instructions clearly. And as the description said, we're going to offer some strategies and some tips. We're going to focus on clear culture, elements of plain language, how to test informally, and how to lower barriers and increase compliance with instructions. The CDC has said that clear communication is crucial to getting our messages across, and also testing with the audience before we release our information is a way to find out if we've hit the mark. So that's what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to discuss how to write instructions, then how to test them. And then I'll give you some clear messaging tips, followed by a Q&A session. And I have to, okay, sorry about that, a little technical glitch there. So let's dive right in with how to write instructions. I'd like to divide the process into 4 steps, and you'll notice that the writing actually begins at step 2. For our purposes today, the second step is going to be to organize the instructions. The first step is always to consider your audience and purpose first, no matter what you're writing. Then we organize the instructions, then we make sure we've written them in plain language, and finally, we make sure that we have formatted in a way that is person-centered. And we're going to talk about each of those steps today. Step 1 is to think about your audience and your purpose. And the most important thing to realize about your audience, for most of you when you're writing health communications, is that it's very diverse. You have to keep in mind that you're going to have to cast a wide net in order to capture a very diverse audience. And therefore, you want to aim your writing to those people who might struggle. In consumer testing, I've never heard anyone say that something is too easy to read. But for those who have difficulty with reading or comprehension, we don't want to put up barriers with the way we give our messages. Our audience is going to include people of varying age and ethnicity and language and country of origin and gender identification and orientation. It's going to include people with various levels of education and literacy, both general literacy and health literacy. And it's going to include people who have a widely varied vocabulary, speaking vocabulary, listening vocabulary, reading vocabulary, and writing vocabulary. It's also usually going to include people with varying degrees of background knowledge on the subject in hand, and even varying degrees of interest. It'll include busy people and people who have difficulty with comprehension. So therefore, we're going to aim our writing to capture the widest audience possible and not leave anyone out because of barriers we have unknowingly put up. As we're thinking about our audience, we should recognize that health literacy is an issue for many people. And lower health literacy is associated with things like education and age, and even how familiar people are with the culture of health insurance. And so we want to keep in mind that many people in our audience have lower health literacy. Studies show that if people are intimidated by something, they're not going to get the message. And 9 out of 10 adults struggle to understand complex health information. And limited health literacy is costly, both financially and in terms of health outcomes. So today, I'm going to show you some ways that you can address the audience where they are and at the same time raise health literacy for your audience. As you're thinking about your audience, you want to remember to be inclusive and respectful and welcoming. If something looks too difficult or looks too formal or looks too authoritative, it puts people off and they might decide not to read it. It's important to know cultural differences about things like healthcare and even communicating about healthcare, and to be mindful of the various levels of education and reading ability and background knowledge, as we said. We want to remember to avoid certain things. Plain language isn't always appropriate, but in the case of health communications, it is usually appropriate. So we want to avoid things that get in the way of plain language, like idioms and slang and jargons, and even sometimes technical words or culture-specific vocabulary. If we want to use a technical or a medical term, we want to make sure that we define it. The other thing is to, in this first step, is to make sure you're considering your purpose. Now, obviously, the purpose that these two authors had was to communicate information to a highly educated, highly informed group of people, a very narrow audience of people who understand medical terms, who are used to reading scholarly articles like this, and who are going to be able to dig through all the words to get the messages. So our purpose is extremely important. Knowing that before we begin to write is crucial. We would certainly never use this if we're communicating to the general public. But we could take everything that's in this and find a way to bring it to the general public. One way is to use a question and answer format. And notice that I've taken all of the information that was in that other piece and I've broken it down into the sections. I've defined certain medical terms that are going to be important for people to know, like influenza and fatigue and epidemic and symptoms. And I've used bullets in order to break up the information into manageable chunks for the reader. Those are some tricks that you can use in order to change the purpose of a dense article like we saw previously to something that will reach a wider audience. Here's another example where the purpose informs how you're going to write. This was on a website, on the CDC website, and it's intended for healthcare professionals and healthcare places, clinics and hospitals and places, on ways to prevent transmission of the flu. The information in here is really good, but the level that the information is aimed at is high. It's again for people who are very familiar with both the vocabulary and the content. This clearly is not something you would post on the clinic wall for the people who work there. But again, you can take that information and you can translate it into plain language. So I've taken that very sort of serious and formal title, Fundamental Elements to Prevent Influenza Transmission, and I've put it into plain language, Stop the Spread of Flu. Again, I've used a bullet list in order to break up the information into manageable chunks. And I've used some of the other strategies of plain language that we're going to talk about today. And the first one we're going to talk about is how I did that bullet list right there. Stay home, get a vaccine, cover your nose and mouth, clean, and follow rules. So let's look at how I organized those instructions. When organizing instructions, these are the steps I follow. First, I divide the instructions into steps, making sure that I use one step for each action. I also then make sure that the steps are in the exact order that they're going to occur. You'd be amazed at how many times I see instructions that aren't in the order that the person is going to do them in. And then I decide whether I'm going to use numbers or bullets. And we're going to talk about that as we go. So here's an instruction about when you should wash your hands at work. The times to wash your hands are all in there. But again, we're leaving it up to the reader to dig through the words to find out when they should wash their hands at work. And we could do that work for them. We could lower the barriers to comprehension if we do some of the work for them. So what I did was I simply took everything that was in there and I divided it up and I split it, for the purpose of this slide, into 2 columns, but it could be 1 column if depending on what your format was going to be, whether this was going to be a piece of paper or up on a website or where it was going to be. And I've listed them, each one specific and brief and in no particular order, because there is no particular order here. So I've used bullets. I've put a little lead in there, wash your hands, and then just simply listed when you should wash your hands. Or this one. In order to decide on one step for each action, I took this paragraph on the left, and first I changed the title because it seemed a little too formal to me. It wasn't telling the reader exactly what they were going to find as they read on. And so I changed the title and made it a how-to. And then again, I took all of the information that was in that paragraph, sentence by sentence, and I simply divided it up into a list, exactly as written, leaving out a few words here and there. But I'm not done yet. I've got one step for each action. Now I have to put them in order because obviously, and the one on the left is what was on the right in the previous slide, obviously you're not going to wash for 15 to 20 seconds after you dry your hands. So I've rearranged my list to make sure that the steps are exactly in the order that they're going to occur. I'm still not done, because now I'm going to make sure that each step begins with an action verb. Instead of plenty of soap to lather, I've changed it to lather with soap. Instead of backs of hands and under nails need attention, I've changed it to include backs of hands. But I'm still not finished yet, because next I'm going to number the steps, because in this case, there is an order, and I want people to be able to follow it. I want people to say, this is the first thing I do, this is the second thing, etc., etc. So I've numbered the steps. And now I'm ready for step 2 in my writing, which is to make sure that this is in plain language. So let's talk about writing in plain language. In examining this and evaluating it, and the one on the left is what was on the right in the previous slide, I've decided that there are a couple of things in here that weren't plain enough for the reader, and that the reader still had some work to do that I could do for him. I began thinking that perhaps lather wasn't as familiar a vocabulary word as I needed. Some people might not recognize it when they read it. Some people might be able to actually read it, but not comprehend it because it's not in their vocabulary. So just to be safe, I changed it to the simple rub. And by the way, we're going to talk about reading grade level in a minute, because some people are required to write materials at a certain grade level. Substituting a one-syllable word for a two-syllable word immediately lowers the grade level, because the way the formulas work is they calculate the numbers of syllables in words and the numbers of words in sentences. And we'll talk about that more later. I've also changed include backs of hands to scrub, because I want to be more specific. I could imagine a reader saying to himself, what do they mean include? That way I don't have to let them sit there and wonder. I can tell them what I mean by include is scrub. So I'm going to use that specific word. Often in consumer testing, we hear people say, I can read it, but I can't understand it, because reading and comprehension are two different things. I've added a couple of words here, and if I were writing this with a team, we might decide not to. I added electric dryer and I added paper to towel. But if this were something that were going to be posted in a restroom that had paper towels and electric dryers, I might want to add that. So again, I'm examining the piece to make sure it's in plain language. Plain language addresses the reader directly. It's clear and concise and friendly. It's as if you were talking. In fact, one way to check to see if you're writing in plain language is to read a piece aloud. And if it sounds conversational, you've hit the mark. It's brief and gives the right amount of information. Now that may seem contradictory, and it is, because sometimes when you're writing in plain language, you actually add words. However, the point in the long run is to be as brief as you can while giving the right amount of information. There are 5 strategies that we like to check to make sure we have done when we're writing in plain language. One is to make sure we've written in active voice. The other is to make sure the tone is friendly. The paragraphs need to be brief and one topic. And the sentences shouldn't be compound or complex. They should be mostly simple sentences. In fact, one way to change something into plain language is to break a sentence that has a conjunction in it in 2 and create 2 separate sentences. And then finally, familiar words are extremely important. Using common everyday vocabulary and defining necessary technical and medical terms. So let's look at each of these in turn. First, we'll talk about voice and tone. On the left is a piece that was written for employees at a company, giving them ways to maintain their mental health during a pandemic. Again, the work has been left up to the reader. The title is technical and authoritarian and formal and uses words like optimal that not everyone will know. And the information is all buried in this wall of words, this one paragraph wall of words. The voice is passive in places. By passive voice, we mean where the verb comes before the noun. Mistakes were made. The current pandemic has resulted in. And that is difficult to read for many people. It's also less friendly. So to lighten this up a little while still giving the same information, I've tried to make it a friendlier tone. Again, I started by changing the title. Now, not everyone knows the background of the British Blitz and this little sign that was later found in a print shop, but everyone has heard this title. In fact, it's almost trite and cliche-ish, but it does resonate with most people. And it says really the same thing. It gives direct advice on how to maintain optimal mental health during a pandemic. The other thing I've done to change the tone is I've addressed the reader directly as you in those numbers down there. And I've also included everyone, we, so that there's a feeling of inclusiveness. Using personal pronouns can change the tone dramatically in a piece. When you approach that first paragraph, you feel almost like you're in a formal lecture. But when you approach the second paragraph, you feel like you're having a conversation where someone is giving you advice about how to keep calm and carry on in a pandemic. There's a word in there that not everyone would know, and that's resilient. And so I've taken the time there to define it. Now, some might say, well, wait a minute, bounce back is a cultural idiom. Not everyone will know that. And so I might want to change that to something like recover or some other word. Bounce back seems so friendly, and if you feel that your target audience will know that idiom, it would be okay to use. And then I've made the list. I've numbered the list, not because you have to follow that particular order, but because it just seemed to me like it flowed better with each one being one specific number. And then I followed my rules for writing instructions exactly as I said before. I split them up, one for each number. I started each with an action verb. I made sure that I spoke directly to the audience, and I put them in an order that seemed logical to me, beginning with focusing on what you can control and ending with some kind of hopefully encouraging statement. So I've said exactly what was in that other piece, but I've just said it in plain language. Next, we'll look at paragraphs and sentences. As I examined this paragraph on the left, which was attempting to talk about social distancing, I realized that it wasn't just about the importance of social distancing. It gave the definition of social distancing, then the importance of social distancing, and then how to do it. So that's exactly how I broke up my paragraphs. I changed the title to make it less specific in this case, because importance wasn't the only thing the paragraph was saying. And then I divided that one long paragraph into three. The first with the definition, the second with the reason to do it, or the importance of it, and then some specific ways to do it. Again, following my rules for writing instructions, dividing and starting with an action verb and putting one instruction per line. I also used my tone and voice strategies from before. And then finally, I want to make sure that I'm using the best words, words that everyone will know. A lot of times that means simply substituting an easier, more conversational word for a more formal word. And if you notice there under asymptomatic, no symptoms, I've defined symptoms. And this can actually be kind of fun to go through a piece and substitute words, making the information easier for the readers and casting a wider net. And then if I'm going to use a reading formula, and there are a bunch of them, I will be able to check to see if I have reached the grade level I've aimed at. And usually for writing that is going to go to a wide audience, public health information, you want to hit somewhere between 6th and 8th grade. You don't want to go too low, you don't want to go too high. If you're writing with Microsoft Word, the Flesch Kincaid is right on there in the review. When you can just click on it when you're checking your spelling and grammar, and it will tell you how much passive voice is in there. It will also tell you what grade level the piece is on. And then, and very important, because it doesn't matter how much I've done with plain language if my design puts up more barriers for the reader, Then I'm going to make sure that I've used person-centered design for my information. And what that means is a sans serif font, enough white space, aligning it to the left, line lengths that are not too short and not too long. And we're going to talk about each of these and why they're important. Page and line breaks that are in the right places, and colors and images that are there for the right reason and that reflect back who the audience is. Font is very important. Serif fonts, like the one on the top with the little feet on each letter, are harder to read, especially on a screen. The sans serif fonts, which is the one in the middle, don't have the little feet on the letters, and so the letters are straight up and down and are easier to read. And as you can see, if you're looking at this screen, fancy fonts are harder to read. And if you use more than one font, it may look cool, but it's putting up a barrier for the reader. So I would say to choose a font that doesn't have a serif. Now, some people worry about Arial because the lowercase L and the uppercase I look the same. So if you're writing a word like illegal at the beginning of a sentence, it looks like 3 L's or 3 uppercase I's in a row. So there are other fonts that don't have serifs that you can choose instead if you don't like Arial. White space is extremely important. If you notice, the paragraph on the left puts up a barrier for the reader. The words are squished together, the lines are squished together, the column is too short. On the right, we've lightened up the space a little. We've put more space between the letters, more space between the lines, and we've made the column a little longer, a little wider. And this helps readers because most readers read in groups of words. If we can group the words in logical groups for them, it helps them as their eyes flow across the line. So spacing is very important. Alignment is also important. Center alignment may look interesting and may be aesthetically pleasing, but it's difficult especially for readers who read word by word and what we call plow across the line. They can get lost, skip a line, not be able to find the line. And so left alignment is just a lot easier to read. Wherever we can, we should use it. In English, we go across, then down, back to the beginning, and across again. And that's the way our lines should go. Long lines are hard to read. Often in field testing, consumer testing, the participant will say, well, by the time I got to the end, I couldn't remember what I read in the beginning. And that is exacerbated by lines that are too long, especially, again, across a screen. So you want to make sure you break your lines in ways that it makes it easier for the eye to track across. And we recommend no more than 15 to 18 words per line. And obviously, you don't want to break a page or a line in the wrong place. Now, I know it's not always possible to make sure your page breaks are in the right place, but wherever you can, pay attention to that. Colors and images should be accessible. They should be culturally diverse. They should be there for a purpose. They should be supporting the content. If they don't support the content, you're better off without them. And they should be chosen so that they don't put up barriers of their own. You also want to make sure that everyone sees themselves in the piece with your images. I can remember a consumer testing participant saying once as he was looking through a brochure, well, I don't think this is for me because I don't see any pictures of dads with kids. I just see moms with kids. But you don't want to pander to your audience and place images in just to show that you're being diverse. You want to make sure that you've chosen just the right image to support the content. Because next, you're going to find out from your consumers whether you've succeeded. I think this is great advice. Test and ask for feedback before you release anything. But some people say, well, we don't have the budget for that. Actually, you really don't need a large budget for it, because you don't need a fancy commercial testing facility with one-way mirrors and all that stuff. All you need to do is sit down with some consumers in your target audience, hand them the thing to read, and see what happens. You're going to ask them questions. You're going to listen to what they say. And very importantly, you're going to watch what they do, because body language often tells you what's really going on. We just recently did some consumer testing by Zoom, and it's very helpful to see the participant. If they're saying to you, oh, this is easy, but their body language is telling you that they are clearly struggling, you've learned something about your piece. You're going to want to focus with consumer testing on things you were concerned about or had questions about as you were writing the instructions, where you think people might have problems, and what is most important that the reader get. Those are where you're going to focus your questions for your consumer testing. You might want to know what the reader's first reaction is, or what they think of the title. Or you might want to know if they understand the source of the instructions. You'll definitely want to know how they feel about the tone. And you'll definitely want to know if they find the instructions easy to read and comprehend and follow, and if they can find important things like due dates and action items. At first, you're going to tell them why you're doing this testing. You're going to reassure them that you're not going to have your feelings hurt if they criticize, because you want to improve these instructions. And you want to also reassure them that you're not testing them, that it's okay to get things wrong. In fact, that's extremely helpful, because you're going to use the information to improve the piece. And then you're going to ask them specific questions. You don't have to do too many, but just zero in on the things you've decided or what you want to focus on, because you're not going to be able to do a total rewrite after you've gone this far. You want to focus in on a few important things that you know you can fix. We like to use the one in the middle a lot, where we ask the participant to read something and then tell us in their own words what it says. We never ask them to read out loud, because many people are uncomfortable with that. But we ask them to read it to themselves and then explain in their own words what it said. You'll know right away if you've written it clearly. You also might want to mix in some scenarios. Can you find this? Pretend you're there doing that. What if you needed to? When do you have to? And that way you'll be able to put the participant in the position of a user who has come upon this thing and is trying to use it. We use these a lot with websites when we're consumer testing website content. As you're going through the consumer testing, you want to make sure that you are checking in with the participant. You want to make sure they're telling you everything they're thinking. You want to encourage them to think out loud. You want to encourage them by telling them that what they're doing is very helpful. And of course, you want to express your gratitude for them participating in the consumer testing. There are some do's and don'ts for testing instructions that I think are important to remember. It's important to not bite off more than you can chew. In other words, it's important not to try to find out everything and plan on fixing or changing everything, but to focus in on a few important goals before you engage in your testing. It's important to listen to what the participant says and probe and clarify to make sure you're really hearing what they're saying, and to follow up if there's something else you could learn from what they've said. It's important to let them know at the beginning how much time this is going to take, because people are busy, and to stay on task and keep moving and honor that time limit. Consistency is very helpful, because when you put your data together, you want to make sure that you haven't tainted your data by testing differently for different participants. And of course, you want to maintain a friendly and professional demeanor so that the participant takes the consumer testing seriously, but isn't intimidated or put off by the atmosphere. And then some don'ts. You want to make sure that you don't lead them in any way or give them answers or help them get the right answers. You don't want to praise them when they get the right answers, because then you're contradicting the fact that you told them you're not testing them, you're testing the materials. So you just want to encourage them by saying thank you when they get it, whether they get it right or they get it wrong. They may ask you questions that are specific about the information, and you can at some point say, I can't answer your question right now, but I can't, because I'm trying to find out how people understand this, how well people understand this when there isn't someone there to help them, but I can answer your question at the end. And you certainly don't want to let any thoughts you have about the piece influence the testing. Even if you think it's way too difficult and your colleague wrote it and you thought it was too difficult, you don't want to say, I know this is hard. Let the participant tell you what they think, and then use that information to improve the messaging. Which brings us to our final section, some clear messaging tips. Now, I could spend another hour just talking about some clear messaging tips. So I thought long and hard about what I would include for the purpose of this webinar. And here are some that I came up with. One is that sentence case is easier to read than title case. I know that title case is where each important word in the title is capitalized, is the norm and the commonly used method. But where we can, we like to use sentence case where the title looks like a sentence, just simply because it's easier to read. And if you want to make your message clear, your title has to describe exactly what is in the message. And those are the ones we've talked about before. The one at the bottom is the one that I made a little more sort of not describing exactly what was in there, but giving them a motivation to read. And because that's one of the things you want your title to do. You want your title not to turn people off and make people think, oh boy, this is going to be dense, this is going to be difficult, I'm just going to skip it. You want to make sure that your title is a motivator to make sure that people want to read on. And that you want to explain to them what they're going to find when they read on. A lot of people use all capital letters to show that something is important. And this worries me because for two reasons. One is it implies that everything else isn't important. And two, because it's like shouting at the reader. And it's not going to necessarily be effective. The third reason, and perhaps the most important reason, so I guess I have three reasons that I don't like it. A third and the most important reason that I don't like them is that they're harder to read. There are many readers who use the shape of a word to do what we call decode it, that is, figure out what the word is. In other words, if they see the word dog, they use the little stem going up on the D and the little stem going down on the G to recognize dog. You can't do that when words are written in all capital letters. So you've lost people who use structural analysis, recognizing the word by its shape. And another problem, which brings me now to 4 problems with capital letters, is there at the bottom. In some cases, they look like an abbreviation or an acronym, and they're misread. That looks like perhaps a brand of soap or a type of soap. Same thing is true for bold. I have a colleague who says that bold should be used, you should use bold like pepper. Sprinkle it sparingly, because too much bold overwhelms. It has the same problem as all capital letters. If it's used to show that something's important, it sort of implies that they can skip everything else. So it's better to use it sparingly, one word or a date, or as I used in one of the earlier paragraphs, a number. It's also tiring to read, as are italics. Some of you, as you're looking at the screen, may find these words are sort of wavy and sort of swimming around, and that's true for most people. Italics are difficult to read. They also lose their impact, again, when they're overused. and bold italics are even harder to read. So I'm not saying to avoid them completely. I'm just saying be very careful about when and where and how much you use bold and italics. There's really one clear messaging tip on this, but it contains a lot of parts. If you look at that first set, you see that the due date, which is the most important part of that sentence, is buried. Whatever we do when writing in plain language, we do not want to bury our most important message. So I've plucked it out in the second line and I've put it at the end so that it's no longer buried. And this helps the reader in two ways. It helps the reader to find the thing as he's reading for the first time, but it also helps the reader if he has to go back at a later time and find that date. It helps him to be able to spot it quickly. So I put it in bold and I put it at the end of the sentence. And I did one more thing to it. I changed it from the number feature that's in the first line to words. And the reason I did that is because the United States is one of the few countries in the world that puts the month first. There are many people from many countries who would read that date at the top as the 11th of August. Is August 8th? Yes, I think so. So I changed it to the words. Now, this is not always possible because sometimes systems are putting in dates, but where we can, we like to use the spelled out month and not abbreviations because not everyone knows the abbreviations for dates, but the spelled out month written in the convention with the number, the day, a comma, and the year. And many people note that 2020, it's especially important to write it out. In that second piece of information, which is a help paragraph, a contact paragraph, I have again unburied the messages. I've taken out a lot of unnecessary words. I've taken out an idiom, the ubiquitous reach out idiom, and I've made it more specific, call us. I've taken the message out of the centers of the sentences and I've put them at the ends of the line. I've used bold for the phone number so people can go back and find it easily. And I've also changed the sentence about when we're open to make it a lot easier to read and get through. I've taken out some extra words. I've given the reader specifically when it is open, rather than the accept part. I've told them when it is open, Monday through Friday. I've changed the 8 o'clock and the 5 o'clock because there aren't any minutes. It's not like 8:30. And I've just made it 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And then the last thing I've done is I have moved the URL to the end of the line. And I've done that for a very specific reason. A lot of times when people are on a website and they see a link, they'll click on it. If you've put the link in the middle of the sentence, they'll click on it before they've gotten to the end. And this interferes with comprehension. It will block the reader from seeing everything they were supposed to see. It's especially dangerous when the link is going to take them outside of the site to a different site. So I like to, wherever possible, put links at the end of the sentence so that they've read what they need to read before they click away. We also try to make sure that the links describe, if we're going to say click here, instead of that, we would say click, whatever it is that they're going to get to, so that when they get there, they know that they have arrived at the right place. So that brings us to the end of my presentation, except for your questions. So Scarlett, can we take some questions?
Wonderful, and thank you so much, Joan. Yes, we are getting some excellent questions. One of the questions is there a sweet spot for using numbered list versus bulleted list? For example,
Oh,
if it is over X items on a list, would you list the task with bullets or with numbers?
that's a great question. I usually evaluate whether I'm going to use bullets or numbers based on whether there's a particular order or it's a particular number of steps that I want them to know there are only 3 steps to do this, or there are 3 ways to contact us. Then I would number it. If I've given them a specific number, or if they have to do it in a specific order, I would use a number. And if not, if it's just going to be a series of pieces of information, like in that when do you wash your hands slide earlier, I would use bullets. But you bring up with that question a very important point, and that is that you don't want to overwhelm the reader with a list of 40 bullets. It's much better to figure out a way that you can break up the information in another way, or that you can combine some things or eliminate some things. If this is just a list of things, I believe in that other list, and I'm scared to try to go back to it because I don't know if I could find it. But in that list about when to wash your hands, there were some that I sort of put together, like when you handle food, especially raw food, and when you're putting something away. I put a few things together so that the person wouldn't be overwhelmed by a million bullets. Now, I know that sounds like it contradicts the idea of one thing per line, but when you're doing a bullet list, it can be very intimidating for a person to see a huge, long bullet list, and it puts up a barrier to comprehension. So you bring up a very important point, and I like the notion of a sweet spot, and it really comes from evaluating it once you've got it and then testing it to make sure it's okay. So I'm not going to give you a specific number, but just in general, I wouldn't make the bullet list too long, you know, or that too many steps, because then it's overwhelming.
Thank you, Joan. The next question is from Brianna. Your point about sans serif versus serif fonts is interesting. I've read that serif fonts for body text are easier to read because of the little feet. Headers and subheaders should be in sans serif. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it depends on the audience and the purpose too. Serif fonts with the little feet, like Times New Roman, are more formal looking and a little less friendly. And you're right that the research is conflicting. It's definitely shown in research that sans serif fonts are easier to read on a screen. And that's why this webinar is in sans serif font. And because it's more like printing, it is, I think, easier to read for people who have difficulty with reading, people who have limited literacy. This is more the way things are written for people who are just learning how to read. But if you are writing a scholarly article, like that first slide I showed, it would probably be in a serif font. The font style and type tells the audience, gives the audience a clue as to what kind of purpose this material has. I mean, it may be subconscious, but it is definitely different. As I said, serif font being a little more formal.
The next question is from Lauren Wheeler. When talking about time, how do you say 12? Would you say 12 noon or 12 p.m.?
Another great question. I think, again, I hate to be so wishy-washy, but I think, again, it depends. If I were writing the hours, for example, that a contact center were open, or that a customer service line or a helpline were open, I would probably use 12 p.m. If it were in the context of a paragraph, you know, in which the time comes up, I would probably use noon. You know, I can't think of an example right offhand, but if it were in the middle of a paragraph talking about something, if just the same way I would use afternoon or morning or evening, I would use noon if it were in the midst of a paragraph. But I think The other problem is that there are people who are unsure whether 12 p.m. is at night or in the morning, and whether 12 a.m. is midnight or at the end of the morning. And so that can be confusing. And it's something that we often don't think about because we just assume that everybody knows. But we have to remember that everybody doesn't know what we know.
Next question is from Kira McKinnon. Sorry if I didn't say it correctly. It's, what are your thoughts about the use of contractions?
Wonderful question, and I should have addressed that because you may have noticed that I use them fairly frequently in some of my rewrites. They are friendlier and they do lighten the tone and make it less formal. Now, in some cases, in fact, with some of the people I work with, they're not allowed to use them, and so they don't. And also, I have to give you a caveat on that, a warning on that, and that is that some contractions are better than others. The contraction wheel, for example, W-E apostrophe L-L, can be misread as well. The same with shield. And some people, when they say should have, they say it as if it were should of, O-F, when in fact it's a contraction of should have, and so it's a apostrophe V-E. And so you want to stay away from contractions if they're going to be misread. We usually use them when they're extremely clear, extremely common, and there's no chance that they'll be misread because they do make the tone friendlier. We use words like don't and can't, and other contractions that are not sort of risky ones. I recommend them for their friendliness, but again, I want to make sure that I haven't put any in there that are going to confuse the reader.
Awesome.
Which reminds me to say one more thing, and that is that a good trick for making sure your messages are clear is to write with a specific reader in your mind. When I'm writing messages for a wide-ranging audience, I picture in my mind a woman that I knew who had multiple children, 2 jobs, and had difficulty reading, had only had a 6th grade education. And I write for her because I want her to be able to get my message. And so I keep her in my mind when I'm writing some things. And so it's helpful to have your readers, and maybe even a specific reader, in your mind's eye as you're writing.
Okay, the next question is, any special tips for newsletters?
I think just probably the journalistic tips, you know, of putting your most important messages near the beginning or at the beginning, following the old journalistic style of who, what, when, where, and why, and making sure that your columns are comfortable width for people, and making sure that you're not overusing some of the things like bold and italics, and that you use a kind of an upbeat tone and titles that motivate the reader, and that they're not too long.
Next one, what are the best practices for using checklists?
Great question. Checklists can pose a problem for people because you have to, first of all, be very clear about the directions. The directions have to be right there in place at the beginning before you jump into the checklist. You have to explain exactly what the procedure is and check each box or check all that apply, or in some way let the person know what they're going to be checking off. If it's a checklist that you're writing that you've already, you know, you're just telling them, do this, do this, do this, do this, and they're putting little checklists. You want to follow the same rules that you use for instructions. You're going to make sure that you use one for each item to be checked off, that you begin with an action verb, that you write in plain language, and that you are as brief and to the point and clear as possible with your checklist. Checklists can be very good. One thing I don't like is myth and truth lists, because I think sometimes they can be confusing, and I'm always worried that some people might misread the myths as being the facts. But checklists can be very useful. I like them.
Next question. You mentioned that white space is very important. If you have a paper handout that is just over 1 page, is it better to give 2 pages with more white space or remove some white space and get the handout to 1 page?
Well, I think there's be a third option. I think I'd look at the piece to see if there's any way I can cut it a little to fit it to one piece. I wouldn't want to sacrifice too much white space, but our designers on our team are very good at figuring out ways to confine information to one page that's going to be handed out. You don't want people to have to flip through several or to keep track of several pages. You don't want them to have to keep flipping back and forth from side to side. So I think I'd examine if there's anything I could cut or any way I could reduce the amount of information so that it fits on one side. And then I'd play with the white space a little bit in order to make sure I could do that. And that's why this is really a process of getting from the first moment when you decide you're going to write this thing to the end of the process, where it's finished and ready to go.
Awesome. Next one. Do you usually try to incorporate images in your educational materials for those that have very low literacy or for those that have limited English proficiency?
Yeah, there's a technique of writing using almost exclusively using images. And when you're aiming something at a very, very low literacy level, you just have to be careful that your images don't require too much abstract thinking, because making inferences is a comprehension skill that not everybody has. So you want to make sure that your images are as concrete and as close to whatever it is that you're describing as possible. We had a debate the other day about using a telephone receiver as an image for calling, because everybody has cell phones now and people don't even remember what a telephone receiver looks like. So there are some images that are changing as the world changes, and some images that are sort of standard, that have been around a long time and that everybody recognizes. I would just be careful about choosing images not for their cuteness or aesthetic value or decoration, but to make sure that they are supporting the content, making it clearer, that they are then don't require abstract thinking on the part of the reader.
I notice we have 3 more questions, so I think we have enough time to get through them quickly. The next
Great.
one is, you said to use sans serif font for online materials, but for printed materials, should we use serif so the feet can sort of carry the reader along?
I think more and more we're using sans serif font for printed materials also. I think for all of the reasons we discussed before, I think the serif fonts are kind of old school, because people look at their phones now, they use apps, and everything on those on your cell phone is going to be sans serif. I think we're moving toward that, except in formal writing.
Are some instructions better to be communicated verbally and not written?
That's a great question. I mean, if you have the opportunity, I think verbal communications are very useful, but you don't want people to have to listen to a bunch of instructions and then have to remember them. So perhaps if you could combine the two, that would be the best of all worlds. If you could go through a set of instructions with a person sitting with them and making sure they understand them. I don't think that there's any particular cases where one would be better than the other that I can think of. I think that if you could do both, that would be great.
Okay, last question. Should you write the word "and" or use and the symbol and, which reflects plain language.
What word is that?
Let me read it again. It says, should you write the word and or
Oh,
use
and. Right.
and
Or the symbol and.
for the symbol
The
and?
ampersand. Oh, okay, the ampersand. You know what? I have not really seen any research on this, but I worry that not everyone understands what that ampersand is. And so I tend to use the word, although I know that sometimes in a title or in the heading, people use the ampersand, the little symbol of and. But I do worry that not everyone recognizes that. So I tend to substitute the word where I can. But then I'm trying to cast a really wide net. So again, we go back to the idea of knowing your audience.
Thank you for answering those questions, and everyone, those were amazing questions.
Yes. Thank you all very much.
Next slide. Can we move to the next slide?
Oh, I'm sorry. That was for me.
Thank you. Well, thank you for a wonderful presentation today. Like I mentioned before, the recording will be available on the Health Literacy Solutions Center. You will receive an email containing a link to the eval form if you are requesting CEUs. Your response to the survey is required in order to receive those. And as you know, we try to schedule webinars once a month. So keep an eye on the Health Literacy Solution Center website for details on upcoming webinars. We will be having our Health Literacy in Action and HEART conference in October. So you could also go to that website and get more information and register. And thank you again, Joan. And to everyone who joined today, please stay safe and everyone have a good day.
Thank you all very much for your participation.